Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's 4 o'clock, so we should probably get started right on time. And I'm sure your other colleagues who aren't here yet will be joining us very soon. But welcome back for week number 2 for PPA 500. I'm glad you all decided to come back for another round. So thank you to everyone who submitted your introductory posts. I do appreciate you sharing whatever you felt comfortable sharing with the rest of the class. And I've gone through and reviewed all of those, so thank you for that. We do know coming due then next week, next Tuesday on September 10th, you've got a couple of assignments that are due. You have Canvas essay number 1, and Canvas essay number 1 is a graded Canvas essay. And so for that one, you're going to be looking at Federalist Paper number 10, and we will talk about Federalist Paper 10 tonight and kind of go through the high points of Federalist Paper number 10 and what Madison was trying to tell us in it. And then based upon your understanding of Federalist number 10, what you'll be doing is discussing if you think that our society today is more factionalized than it was back in Madison's time, provide some examples to support your answer, and then answer the question, what do you think we could do in order to better control the effects of factions and better deal with this situation of having all these different specialized interest groups that oftentimes have different conflicting opinions and perspectives on policy. And what can we do to kind of deal with some of the factionalization, if you will, in our current society? So that's for Canvas essay number 1. It's due by next Tuesday. You'll not only be responding to that initial prompt, but then you'll also be responding to the responses of 2 of your classmates. So for next week, you'll be doing a grand total of 3 posts in Canvas essay number 1. Then also next Tuesday, you have the initial skills self-assessment due. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the initial skills self-assessment in our class session last week. So I think you have a really good idea of what it's all about. You got those 3 parts of the initial skills self-assessment. The first part, an ordinal ranking of how much you currently know in all those different skill areas in the MPA program. Then in section 2, just a sentence or 2 in terms of your experience in the areas of budgeting and finance, HR, org theory, policy analysis, and research methods. And then for part 3, just let us know what you would like to get out of the program, the MPA program. So if you're in the MPA program, you're going to complete that initial skills self-assessment as you are entering the MPA program here this semester. If you are not in the MPA program, then do the initial skills self-assessment more from the perspective of entering this course. And so as you enter this course, what's your skill level? What experience do you have? And what would you like to get out of this PPA 500 course? So I just kind of want to make that adjustment just so everyone in the class can do it irrespective of whether you are in the MPA program or not. So those are the 2 assignments that you have due then next Tuesday. We also spent a lot of time last week talking about the MPA program itself and discussing some of the requirements and some of the expectations and policies of the MPA program. So I want to afford you a little bit of time here at the beginning of class after you've already digested some of that information, as well as digested information about the course itself. Do you have any questions about the MPA program, any questions about any of that orientation information, or any questions about the PPA 500 course itself? At any time, if any questions do emerge, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions as they may pop up. So where we are tonight is we're going to begin a discussion of the foundations of American government. And we're going to talk about American government in terms of its impact upon public administration and what we do on a daily basis as public administrators. So I don't want to turn tonight's session into an intro to American government type of political science class. But since everything that we do, we tend to do within government and sometimes nonprofit organizations, and everything we do has some connection to public programs and public policies that come from enabling legislation passed by either legislative bodies or from executive orders and directives that come from executive officials such as a president or a governor or a mayor or a city manager. Everything we do is really rooted in American government, and recognizing that so many people come into the MPA program from a variety of different academic backgrounds, and it may not be that you were a political science major. You may have taken American government in the past, and most people have, but it may have been many years ago. It may have just been one American government course. So, talking about the foundations of American government and how public administration is rooted in the foundations of American government tonight, I think does a good job of putting us all on an even playing field, so we all have the same basic foundational understanding of the role public administrators play in our system of American government. So that's our goal for tonight. The way I have it envisioned is in the first half of class tonight, we'll go through these foundational aspects of American government. Then we'll take about a 10-minute break. And then the second half of class, we'll turn our attention to the Constitution. And I think I had mentioned to you last week, one of the reasons why we spend time looking at the Constitution, number one, this is probably the only opportunity you'll have in your entire time in the MPA program to take a look at the Constitution. And then number two, because as public administrators, we have qualified good faith immunity, which requires us to know and then endeavor not to violate the constitutional rights of citizens we deal with. So it's very important for us as public administrators to have a good, solid understanding of what those constitutional rights are, so that we will not violate those rights and we can still be afforded qualified good faith immunity for the actions that we take within the scope and within the parameters of our job in our government or nonprofit organizations. And so I think it's important that we do spend the second half of class going through the Constitution. And it also doesn't hurt as well. We are in a presidential election year. We're 60 odd days away from, and I put the emphasis on odd days away from the presidential election. And so it's a really nice time, a really good time to take a look at the Constitution and just kind of do a refresher on our constitutional system of government. So let's jump into it. And some of these concepts, probably most of these concepts, you're probably familiar with. I just want to kind of put a little flesh on the bones with them, and then always make this connection of the material we talk about tonight and what does that then mean for our jobs as public administrators and more globally, the field of public administration itself. So we know that our system of American government is very much predicated on the limitation of governmental power. When you think about the framers, and usually when I refer to the people who put the Constitution together, I typically refer to them as the framers as opposed to the founders. And it's just kind of my preference, because these are the individuals who did frame the parameters of our constitutional system of government. A lot of other people in subsequent years helped to found our government, but these are the people, these framers are the ones who really framed our Constitution. So they framed all the issues for us. And then we today, over 200 years later, we are still operating within that generalized framework. So when the framers were putting together this system of government, they were really toiling between two different influences. On the one side, they were dealing with a monarchy, and essentially what really kind of amounted to a dictatorship. So they had a king, and the king really had great control over just about all aspects of economic life going on in the colonies. So they had this recognition of what it meant to live in a system whereby you had this very top-down, centralized type of power, as in the monarchy. But then when you really got your feet on the ground in British colonial America at the time in the 1700s, there was more fragmentation. There was more fragmentation in terms of having the different colonies and different approaches used by the different colonies. Sometimes colonies used different currency than other colonies. Some colonies had different legal approaches than other colonies. So on the other side of the equation, they had great fragmentation that they had become familiar with. So there are competing forces that were pulling them in opposite directions. centralization from the British monarchy, and then fragmentation from the system of British colonies that we had in British colonial America. Given those two kind of countervailing forces, one of the primary things they had to grapple with was the amount of power that government should have. And the basic agreement, if you will, among a lot of the framers at the time was that we needed some guardrails that we could place upon government to make sure that government would not become too powerful. So that desire to limit governmental power led to the two basic pillars of our system of American government: separation of powers and federalism. Separation of powers, as we all know, was the separation of power horizontally across different branches of government, whereas American federalism is the separation of power vertically across national government versus state governments. So horizontal separation of powers and a vertical separation of powers to limit the inherent powers of government. In terms of separation of powers, this is what Alexander Hamilton wrote about in Federalist 28 when he talked about the need to balance ambition against ambition. So he knew that people who would be in these positions were going to be ambitious people. He was a highly ambitious person himself. Most of the framers were very highly ambitious people. When you think about most of these framers, especially we'll get to the Constitution in a couple minutes, but especially at the Constitutional Convention, you're looking at people who are in their sometimes mid to late 20s, maybe very early 30s, and granted, lifespans were a lot shorter then, but these were very young, very ambitious people. And so they understood ambition. And Hamilton in Federalist 28 talked about how we needed to balance ambition against ambition. And that's the type of thing we get from separation of powers. We're going to balance the power of members of a legislature with the members, with a chief executive, with a judiciary. And that's what we get with these three different branches of government. And just as a little aside note there on the three pictures you see on the screen, that middle picture that stands for the president, that's President James K. Polk out of Nashville, Tennessee. And I put James Polk up there just because it's kind of appropriate now for what we are currently living through with our presidency, in that President Joe Biden decided not to run for re-election after one term. Same type of thing happened with President Polk. President Polk, having achieved most of the things that he wanted to achieve in his 4 years, decided that he was going to go home to Nashville, Tennessee, and didn't want to pursue a second term in the White House. And so there's kind of a little nice correlation there between the 1840s with James Polk and what we're seeing today with President Biden. And as another side note, I don't know, I'm going to really date myself here, but if you're familiar with a band called They Might Be Giants, They Might Be Giants actually has a song called James K. Polk. And if you're interested in the life and times of James K. Polk, you can always listen to the They Might Be Giants song. But that's who that is in the center of the screen, standing for the executive. So legislative and executive and judicial branch. As we'll see in the Constitution, this speaks to Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. Article 1 dealt with the legislature. Article 2 dealt with the executive, the presidency, and Article 3 dealt with the Supreme Court as the sole representative of the judiciary at the time. And then with federalism, your vertical type of representation of the separation of powers, we are looking at the differences between the national government and state governments. And we'll get into a much more protracted discussion of that when we talk about the conflict between federalists and anti-federalists in a few minutes. But it's important for us to know, since a lot of us work at the local level of government, when we are talking about the term constitutional federalism, we are talking about the relationship between the national government and state government. We are not talking about local governments. Local governments are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. They have no legal standing in the U.S. Constitution. The only powers that local governments have are powers that are provided to them by the state in either state law or in state constitutions. There is a very famous maxim in American federalism known as Dillon's Rule. And if you took American government in the past, you're probably familiar with this, but I'll put it in text chat. Dillon's Rule. And Dillon's Rule is named after an Iowa judge in the 1800s. And Judge Dillon promulgated this rule saying that local governments were creatures of the state, that local governments belong to the state since they have no standing in the US Constitution. State governments create local governments. State governments can then eliminate local governments if they would like. They can shape the powers and responsibilities of those local governments. But local governments fall within the sphere of power and influence of the state government. And just kind of underscore this idea of local governments as creatures of the state. In recent years here in California, we have seen the state legislature kind of kick around the idea of taking the incorporation status away from some cities, especially here in Southern California. And there is some discussion in the past few years of the state legislature removing the incorporation of status as a city from a city like Yarupa Valley. We've seen them discuss that with the city of Vernon. And if you're familiar with the city of Vernon is primarily commercial and industrial. And so you don't have a lot of residents in Vernon. It's primarily commerce and industry. And so much so that the population density is low enough in Vernon that the state legislature at times has talked about making Vernon an unincorporated area and to remove city status from the city of Vernon. State governments can do that under Dillon's rule because they do have ultimate control over local governments. And we'll explore that a little bit more when we talk a little bit more in depth about federalism in a few slides. But those are our basic two pillars: horizontal separation of powers and then
Can
a
you
vertical
explain
separation in
the
federalism.
benefits?
So in terms
Sorry,
of
can you
our
explain the
type
benefits
of
of
government,
an
our type of
unincorporated
government
area?
is a democracy as well as a republican form of government. So I think we're all kind of familiar with the idea of a democracy. So let me put it to you and ask you the question, what is a democracy? How would you define a democracy? Because again, there are a lot of governments around the world that call themselves democracies, and we would probably take issue with it and say they're not democracies. But what is a democracy to you? Oh yeah, there's a question in text chat. Um, Lavana, can you explain the benefits of making a local government an unincorporated area? Sure. The idea with an unincorporated area that if it's no longer a city, all unincorporated areas here in Los Angeles County fall under the purview of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. And so decisions about how those unincorporated areas are governed will then be made by the respective supervisor. And so if it's in the supervisorial area of Catherine Barger, then all those unincorporated areas then kind of fall within her purview. And so I don't want to call her the mayor of those cities, but basically her office is kind of in charge of that type of decision making. And so whenever you make an area unincorporated, what you're doing is you're returning the decision-making power to a centralized source such as the Board of Supervisors. Whenever a city then gets incorporated, that city then has the ability to make some of its own decisions in terms of the type of government it wants to have. So for instance, here in California, a lot of our cities are what we refer to as a weak mayor form of government. In a weak mayor form of government, the mayor comes out of city council. So instead of having a separate mayoral election, you'll have an election for city council. And then typically either the person who gets the most votes in the city council election becomes mayor, or what's more common here in California is that the office of mayor, the position of mayor, will then be passed between city council members on a rotational type of basis. And so deciding whether you want to be a weak mayor form of government or a strong mayor form where your mayor is independently elected, if you are an incorporated city and you have home rule power, you're able to make that type of a decision. So you can be either a strong mayor or a weak mayor form of government. It also provides you a lot more control over your budgeting and how money is being spent. And so being incorporated means more power for the city. Being unincorporated means more power for the county board of supervisors. And that's kind of the basic distinction between being incorporated and being unincorporated. But that's a great question. Let's say in textual government is
Thank
where the
you.
people have liberty and vote directly on issues. I think that's a really great way to look at. In a democracy, people make decisions directly. And so oftentimes in a democracy, you would have issues placed upon the ballot, and then those issues are voted directly by the voters at that ballot box at that election, as opposed to having those decisions made by elected officials. When decisions are being made by an elected official, then you have a Republican form of government. When decisions are being made directly by individual citizens, you have a Democratic form of government or a democracy. As you all know, we are a democratic republic. So we combine elements of both a democracy as well as a republic. And you've probably heard it before, but there's that famous quote from Benjamin Franklin when he was asked by someone, what type of a government do we have? And Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if we can keep it. Because we do go and vote for people to then go to city government, to go to state government, to go to national government, and then make decisions for us. That's a Republican form of government as opposed to us as citizens making decisions on individual issues ourselves. Now, the interesting thing about our system of government, because we have so much fragmentation and we have so much variability in terms of how each of our different state governments operate, some states have more elements of a democracy than other states do. So you think about here in California. Here in California, we have a lot of elements of a democracy in that we have ways in which people can vote directly on issues and make decisions directly. We have things such as an initiative process and things such as a referendum process. The initiative process occurs where you have a group of citizens who circulate a petition typically. And if they can get enough signatures on this petition, they can then force an issue onto the ballot to be voted on directly by the citizens. And so usually here in California, the number of signatures that you need to get to force an issue onto the ballot is usually going to be equivalent to about 8% of the number of voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. And I'm sure most of you have voted in California before, so you know about these propositions. Those propositions oftentimes come onto the ballot as a result of this type of initiative process. So people will circulate these petitions, they'll get people to sign the petitions, then the signatures will go to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State would then have to determine whether or not those are valid signatures. Are those real registered voters? And are those people who are registered with where they say they are registered when they provide their home address? And if you have enough registered voters' signatures on your petition, then that issue can then be placed upon the ballot. That's an initiative type of process. Then you have a referendum process. There are different types of referenda. We won't really get into all of them, but the primary idea behind a referendum here in California is oftentimes the state legislature will decide, we don't want to make a decision on this issue. This is an issue that we think is important enough that the citizens should be able to chime in on. And so they will then place an issue on the ballot themselves to then have the citizens vote directly on that issue. And that's usually in the form of what we call a referendum. So it's not 100% true, but usually initiatives will come from the people. Referenda will oftentimes come from the state legislature, where the state legislature places the issue onto the ballot. But through initiatives and referenda, people can participate directly in making decisions at the ballot box. So we have those provisions here in California. Not every state has those same provisions. There are some states that do not have an initiative process, or some states that have a very limited referendum process, where in order for the state legislature to put something on the ballot, they have to have a supermajority in the state legislature before they can allow people to directly vote on that issue. So in terms of democracy, all state governments have some elements of democracy. It's just some states have more democratic elements than other states. But the Constitution does provide to us as citizens that our state governments must provide us with a Republican form of government. That's one of the requirements of state governments in this country. They must provide their citizens with a Republican form of government. And in that Republican form of government, we then elect people to go and make decisions for us. So we are a democratic republic. Some people like to refer to us as a constitutional republic because these elements of this Republican form of government really come directly from the Constitution. And we'll talk in a second about the social contract and how our Constitution is this social contract. So we are a democratic republic. So let's pick up on this idea of social contract theory. Our democratic republic is predicated upon the idea that power comes from the people. So if power emanates from the people, then the people must decide what powers to give to government because those powers belong with the people as opposed to belonging with government. So the people and their government come to an agreement in terms of here are the powers that we are going to give to government officials, and then those governments will use those powers judiciously to provide for the welfare of society. That is an agreement, that is a contract that comes in the form of a constitution. That's what we refer to as social contract theory. And if you did political science work undergraduate, I'm sure you're very familiar with British philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, John Locke and his second treatise on government. This idea of social contract theory comes directly from John Locke in his second treatise on government. Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of John Locke. He read everything that John Locke ever wrote, and then oftentimes parroted his phraseology. And so things like, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that comes directly from John Locke's passage, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So we know the framers were very heavily influenced by John Locke in this idea of social contract theory. So the contract is the Constitution. It's this agreement between the people and their government. Now, the question becomes what happens when government violates this contract? What happens when government violates the Constitution, when government uses powers that are not given to them, or if they use those powers in ways that are not seen as being prudent and judicious, they're abusing their power, what can then happen? Well, according to other philosophers such as Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson, it is not only the ability of the citizens to overthrow their government when that happens, but it is indeed their duty to overturn their government if the government violates the social contract, violates the Constitution. So you really can't overemphasize enough the importance of the Constitution in our system of government because it is this ironclad contract between the people and their governmental organizations. So if our system of government is really based upon this social contract, based upon this Constitution, what have our constitutions looked like in the past? And we've basically had two constitutions in our history. We had the Articles of Confederation, which did not last very long. And then those Articles of Confederation, that first constitution, was then replaced by our current constitution that we have today. So we've had two constitutions in our history. Now, I've given you a link on our Canvas site so you can go and actually take a look at the Articles of Confederation. We are not going to dissect the articles like we're going to dissect the Constitution in this class because the articles are obviously defunct. They were replaced with the Constitution. But it's still important for us to recognize some of the flaws that were inherent in the articles that then gave rise to the creation of this new Constitution, this new social contract that we live under today. So when you looked at the Articles of Confederation, I'm hoping that a few things really jumped out at you. One of the things I hope jumped out at you is that the articles refer to this union of the states as being a firm league of friendship. So these states were joining together into this firm league of friendship known as the United States of America under the Articles. Now, when you talk about a firm league of friendship, sure, the word firm is there, but it is a league of friendship. And a league of friendship really has a much more transient, much more temporary feeling to it than a united nation. And so when you're talking a firm league of friendship, it was possible that if New York wanted to pull out this firm league of friendship, it could do so at any time. If Pennsylvania wanted to pull out, it could do so at any time. One of the provisions in the Articles of Confederation is that the delegates from each of these states that were sent to this meeting of the states known as a Congress, that the states could remove those delegates anytime they wanted. And so if a state didn't like what was going on in this meeting, this thing known as a Congress, they could just pull their delegates, bring them back home, and basically say, we're taking our marbles back home and we're not going to play anymore. That's because it was this league of friendship. Another really important point that I hope jumped out at you is when you look for the term United States of America being used as a proper noun, capitalized, United, capitalized States, capitalized America. When it's used as a proper noun, we see it used as a proper noun when we're referring to the title of the Confederation, when we're talking about the title of this union between the different states. The articles will say the style of this confederation shall be the United States of America. That's really the only time that United States of America is used as a proper noun in the Articles of Confederation. Every other time that we refer to the United States throughout the Articles of Confederation, the reference is typically the United States in Congress assembled. So what that really tells us is that this was a confederation. This was a union of these states only when the states got together in this Congress. And Congress on the articles was, that term was used as a meeting. And so Congress is synonymous with the word meeting. So, tonight we're having a Congress of PPA 500. Today, when we think about Congress, we think about Capitol Hill. We think about a permanent institution. The framers didn't think about it as a permanent institution under the Articles. It was a meeting of the states. So the United States, the states are only united when they are together in this meeting, in this Congress, doing their business. Also under the Articles of Confederation, we basically had a one-branch government. We didn't have this separation of powers, this horizontal separation across three different branches of government. We essentially just had this Congress, this meeting of the states. The president was essentially a figurehead. This was someone who came out of this Congress. The Congress would select somebody to be the president. The president really had very little in terms of powers. Powers were all vested within the states and the delegates that were sent by those states to this Congress, this meeting of the states. The Articles of Confederation were truly a confederation, and there is a difference between a confederation and a federation. In a confederation, the members of that confederation, those individual states, all retain their own sovereignty and all retain their own power. So they don't necessarily give their power up when they join this confederation. They keep their sovereignty, they keep their individual power, and then the functions and the responsibilities all reside at that state level. That is a confederation. By contrast, a federation is where those members, those states, will give up some of their powers to the central government, so that the central government will have more authority, if you will, over those states than what you would see in a confederation. So the confederation is a lot more of a loose type of alliance, a firm league of friendship, as opposed to what a federation would be. So in these Articles of Confederation, we had this loose confederation, this loose alliance, this friendship between these different states. The states retain their own power and their own decision-making authority. Yeah, the question, what can we explain what powers are given up or what power states give up in a federation? So for instance, in a federation, we'll see state governments give up power in terms of defense, and they'll give those powers up to the central government because the central government will be viewed as being better positioned to provide national defense as opposed to relying upon individual state militias. So that's one type of power that can certainly be given up. The power to coin money is another example. So in the articles, if you had all these individual states, these individual states had their own currencies. So when they become a federation, they give up the ability to coin money. That is then a prohibited activity of states. It becomes the sole domain of the national government, the sole domain of Congress to coin money. And so those are some that are those powers that get given up to the central government when you move from a confederation into a federation. And so it's a really important point because one of the primary problems in the Articles of Confederation is that many people felt that the Articles created too weak of a national government. Since state governments retained all their powers and state governments retained their own state militias and defense was being provided by these state militias, we didn't have a standing army or a standing navy. There's a lot of concern about what happens if a foreign nation comes over and invades us. What protection do we have? How are we going to protect ourselves if we just have this amalgamation of all these different state militias? And that concern really came to fruition after the adoption of the Articles of Confederation with Shays' Rebellion. And if you remember anything from your American history classes, Shays' Rebellion was what we refer to as a triggering event. Now, I don't know if we mentioned it last week, but when you go on and take your 670 policy analysis course, you will talk a lot about how policies are made. And the genesis of a lot of our public policies tends to be a triggering or focusing event. So something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to change our approach to this policy or this issue. And you think about something like the events of September 11th. That was a triggering event that galvanized public opinion around supporting a change to the way in which we deal with airline safety. And so we've led to the creation of Homeland Security and the Transportation Safety Administration, the TSA, led to all these changes in terms of requirements to fly in airplanes. All those things came about because of that triggering, that focusing event. Shays' Rebellion was the triggering event that helped to move us from the Articles of Confederation to replacing it with this new Constitution. Now, in Shays' Rebellion, not to make this a history class, but essentially, just with broad brushstrokes, what happened is you had a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays. And Daniel Shays led a rebellion of farmers. And farmers were angry because they were losing their farms. They were unable to pay their debts. They were unable to sell their crops. And so they rebelled. And so Daniel Shays led this rebellion of these farmers, and they were farmers. And these farmers, this rebellion was very difficult to put down. And it took the state militia in Massachusetts some time to actually put down this rebellion. And to be quite honest, it wasn't just that one rebellion. The Shays part of the rebellion gets all the publicity, but there were multiple rebellions around the state of Massachusetts. This was just the one that really is remembered in history because of being led by a retired Army captain. And the problem was it took so long for the militia to put down this rebellion of farmers. It raised a lot of concern that, well, what happens if France comes over or England comes back over? How are we going to fend off that type of foreign invasion if we can't even put down an insurrection of farmers? And so that trigger event then led to a discussion of, well, we need to have another constitutional convention where we can make amendments and changes to the Articles of Confederation to strengthen the national government, at least in the area of defense. Now, we didn't mention it, but one of the other flaws in the Articles of Confederation is if you wanted to amend the Articles, the only way to amend the Articles was with unanimous agreement of all 13 states. So to get that unanimous agreement, you basically had to go into another constitutional convention so that you could sit down face to face with all the delegates from all these different states and then hammer out these changes to the Articles. So that's why we ended up with this second constitutional convention. Now, at this constitutional convention, the goal of the convention was only to amend the Articles to strengthen the national government's hand in provision of national defense. However, very quickly, the convention kind of started getting out of hand in terms of the focus shifted from just amending the articles to getting rid of the articles completely and replacing them whole scale with a brand new constitution. And that happened for a variety of reasons. But one of the primary movers and shakers, if you will, at this constitutional convention was our good friend James Madison from the state of Virginia. Madison at this constitutional convention was what we consider to be more of a federalist. Federalists wanted to see a constitution that more empowered the national government, that provides the national government with more power, not only over national defense, but over things such as the economy and creating this national treasury, and really want to see a stronger, more vital national government. On the opposite side, we had what were called the anti-federalists, led by people like Sherman and oftentimes people from smaller states. And the anti-federalists only wanted to amend the articles. They wanted to keep the sovereignty of state governments, just wanted to amend the articles to strengthen the national government's hand with national defense. So you have these two combating interests, these two conflicting interests. The way in which the convention kind of went down is that the people who got, the delegates who got to the convention first, tended to come from the Federalist camp. They were James Madison and people who were more Federalist in terms of their ideology. It took a lot of these anti-Federalist supporters a while to get to the convention. And you think about what it was like to travel at that point in time. You had roads that certainly were not paved. They were muddy roads. You had rains and your carriages were getting stuck in the mud. And it took some people a long time to get to the convention. By the time a lot of these anti-federalists got to the convention, Madison and the Federalists already had gotten the ball rolling downhill toward replacing the articles with a brand new constitution that would empower the national government. And so by the time the anti-federalists showed up, it was almost already game over. But another thing that happened at the convention that allowed for the replacement of the articles with the new constitution was the philosophy and the approach of James Madison. Madison realized that the anti-federalists were going to be willing to agree that the national government needs more power over defense. But he knew if they were going to replace the articles with the new constitution, he would have to get the anti-federalists to agree that they wanted a lot more out of the national government than just better national defense. He would have to get them to admit that they wanted a stronger national government for economic reasons as well. So when you think about the delegates who were at this constitutional convention, by definition, they were all white, they were all male, and they were all property owners. Those white male property owners were what we call the creditors for the Revolutionary War. These are the people who spent the money and loaned the money to make the Revolutionary War possible. Now that we're several years removed from the Revolutionary War, they wanted to get their debts repaid. Madison knew that. And so he knew that if he could press that nerve with the anti-federalists and get the anti-federalists to admit that they wanted a national government that could regulate the economy in a stronger way in order to get their money back, then he would have them and he would win the day. And this whole idea of delegates wanting to get their debts repaid is something that was discussed by a historian by the name of Charles Beard. And many years ago, this historian named Charles Beard wrote a book called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And when he published this book, it really opened up a whole firestorm in the world of history. If historians can get upset about anything, they got upset about this. Because what Beard argued is he argued that these framers, because they were the creditors, they were these white male property owners, their primary motivation at the Constitutional Convention was to get their money back. They had an economic type of motivation. Well, a lot of historians did not like that because it kind of flew in the face of the more altruistic interpretation of why the framers were writing this Constitution to begin with. And so he got a lot of pushback from his colleagues in the world of history. Where the field of history kind of finally ended up coming down to an agreement is that, yes, there is an economic imperative at the Constitutional Convention. Yes, the delegates were there for economic reasons, but they weren't necessarily there for their own economic self-interest, but they were there for the economic interests of the states that they were representing. So you certainly have the world of history agreeing that there was a very strong economic imperative here at the Constitutional Convention. And once Madison was able to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of the national government than just defense, it was game over. And then you had the Constitution being formulated to then replace the Articles of Confederation and to become our second and what is now our current Constitution. So, like I said, in the second half of class tonight, we will go through and kind of dissect the Constitution. So it's not really in the scope of what we're talking about in the first half of class to talk about that now. But in this Constitution, we had this creation of a much stronger national government. We had the creation of these three different branches of government through Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. We had this strong pronouncement of national government power in terms of the Supremacy Clause that we find in Article 6 of the Constitution. We have an enumeration of specific powers that belong to the Congress, this bicameral Congress that's created in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. We have at the end of Article 1, Section 8, the statement of the Elastic Clause, saying that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in it. And so we give this huge grant of power, this very broad grant of power to Congress that you can do anything that you deem necessary that will help you carry out all these powers that we have listed for you in Article 1, Section 8. So the Constitution creates this much stronger, much more vibrant national government than the states ever envisioned back in the Articles of Confederation. But the creation of this new Constitution at the Constitutional Convention is really the result of conflict. And one of the things that we know when we read Federalist Paper number 10 is that Madison tells us that in a democracy, conflict is natural. Conflict is going to occur in a democracy. You cannot eliminate conflict. The best thing you can do is to try and manage conflict. And the reason why we have conflict in a democracy, according to Madison, is that you have all these specialized groups. You have all these different factions. And one faction will come into conflict with another faction because they want different things. So in Federalist number 10, he proposes two possible ways in which we could deal with this conflict that emerges from these different factions. One way is to eliminate factions. Well, you can't do that because if you eliminate factions, you're eliminating democracy. One of Madison's most enduring contributions to our understanding of government was his advocacy for this thing known as a compound republic. So Madison argues that the most effective way of creating a government is to create what he called a compound republic. Now, that was kind of a, no pun intended, revolutionary idea at the time, because most philosophers thought that the most efficient and effective way to run a government was not through a compound republic, but instead through a compact republic. And so philosophers such as Montesquieu and others said that in order to be effective and efficient as a government, we need to have a compact republic. And by compact republic, they mean a government with a small jurisdiction where the residents, the people in that government, all share very similar types of opinions and similar types of ideas. You have a very homogeneous population that is in a small geographic area, a very compact type of government. Madison counters that with his compound republic, saying, no, the most effective and efficient way is through a compound republic where you govern a large jurisdiction with a lot of different people, a lot of different types of groups that all have different opinions. And so if you would eliminate those groups, you're eliminating democracy. You're saying everyone cannot have different opinions. Everyone has to have the same opinion. That's antithetical to a compound republic. So instead of eliminating these groups, he argues in Federalist Paper number 10 that we control their effects. And we control their effects by balancing one group against another group. And that was kind of the primary contribution that Madison made to this compound republic theory. Well, a microcosm of these conflicts you see in a democracy really occurred at the Constitutional Convention, in that you had three primary conflicts that were going on at the convention. The first conflict that you had at the convention, the conflict between large states and small states. So you had large states like New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania. They had the larger populations, at least in terms of New York and Pennsylvania, were much more commercially based. And so they had a lot more people and a lot more wealth. And those larger states wanted the Congress, this legislature, to be based upon proportional representation. Because obviously, if it's based on proportional representation, they would be more represented in Congress than smaller, less populated states would be. Small, less populated states wanted to have equal representation in Congress. And so, as we all know from our study of American government, the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, was to take the proportional representation from the Virginia plan and the equal representation from the New Jersey plan, the small state plan, and combine them together into a bicameral legislature, where you have a House of Representatives where people are elected based upon proportional representation, and then we have a Senate where each state gets 2 representatives irrespective of their size or their population. So that great bicameral legislature, that great compromise, was the way in which we dealt with that first conflict at the convention, the large state versus small state conflict. So the way in which the framers at the convention dealt with that first conflict, I think, was relatively admirable, and it created this new idea of how a legislative body should look, and it was relatively innovative at the time. However, the second conflict they obviously dealt with much more poorly, and that was the conflict between slave states and non-slave states. Slave states obviously based most of their economy on the institution of slavery. They wanted slavery written into the Constitution. They wanted the institution of slavery put into the Constitution. Hamilton and Madison and a lot of other Federalists argued very strongly against that, because they knew if the institution of slavery itself was written into the Constitution, whenever you put something in a Constitution, you cement it, you freeze it, and it becomes very difficult to then change that institution. So Hamilton and Madison successfully fought against putting the institution of slavery into the Constitution. However, the compromises that they came to obviously were certainly far less than ideal. And the one compromise they came to was the 3/5 compromise, dealing with how representation would be calculated in terms of an enslaved person counting as 3/5 of a free person for the purpose of proportional representation. And then another way they dealt with it, an equally bad way they dealt with it, was by prohibiting the banning of the slave trade until at least 1808. Free states were arguing, especially abolitionists, were arguing for eliminating the slave trade in the Constitution. Slave states obviously pushed back very hard on that. So the compromise they came to is that the slave trade would be untouched until at least the year 1808, and there could be no law outlawing the slave trade until at least 1808. So the framers took that issue and they certainly punted it to a future generation. The third area of conflict at the convention we've already talked about, and that's the conflict between Federalists like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and anti-Federalists such as Sherman and others. Federalists believed in a stronger national government. Anti-Federalists believed in stronger state governments, and they wanted state governments to remain as sovereign as possible. As we go through our discussion of the Constitution in the second half of class, we will go through the examples of how the ideas of the Federalists made it in the Constitution and how some of the ideas of the Anti-Federalists made it into the Constitution as well. There's a really great Federalist paper that I also have linked on our Canvas site, number 39, that's also written by James Madison. And in Federalist number 39, Madison talks about the Constitution as being, is it a federal document or a national document? And this is where it kind of muddies the waters a little bit, because our use of the term federal today is different than the use of the term federal by Madison and the framers in the late 1700s. When we use the word federal today, we usually use it to refer to the federal government. We usually kind of use federal synonymous with national. Sometimes people say national government, sometimes people say federal government. And that's kind of how we use the term today, kind of like centralization at national level. Back in Madison's time, when they talked about a federal form of government, they were talking more about what we today would refer to as a confederation. So they were referring more to states retaining their power. And so when you read Federalist 39, I think what Madison does is he does a really good job of deconstructing the Constitution and asking the question, is the Constitution national in terms of creating a strong national government, or is it more federal in terms of leaving these powers to the state governments? So is it national or is it federal? The Federalist Papers themselves, those 85 Federalist Papers that were written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay. And admittedly, John Jay only wrote, I believe, 4 or 5 of the papers. Madison wrote somewhere in the range of 29, 27 and 29, and then over 50 of the remaining papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton certainly liked to write a lot more than Madison did. Jay fell ill after he wrote his 4 or 5 papers, and he was kind of out. But those are the 3 authors of these Federalist Papers. As you know, for your American government class, the Federalist Papers, those 85 Federalist Papers, were written to try and convince the anti-Federalists to support the Constitution. They were written to try and convince the anti-Federalists to ratify this Constitution, that this Constitution would not create too strong of a national government. And that's what we see Madison doing in Federalist Paper 39. So when you read Federalist Paper 39, what you see him doing is he'll say things such as, well, let's look at the Constitution in terms of where the Constitution came from and where this new government came from. Well, he makes the argument that where it came from, that's much more of a federal idea in that it came from the states. So the states all sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Those delegates were representing their states. The states ratified the Constitution. So therefore, the states created this new Constitution. The states created the Union. So in that respect, it's not national, it's more federal in nature. And he was saying that to allay the concerns of the anti-federalists, the ones who wanted, more state power. And so you're saying, see, this is where state power comes from, is the government itself comes from the states. He talks about the exercise of power. And do states have more control of the exercise of power, or does the national government? Says when you think about things like the Congress, so the House of Representatives, that's more national in nature because people are directly elected and they are elected based upon proportional representation. However, in the Senate, because these are equal representation and these senators are selected by state legislatures as opposed to being directly elected by the people, that's more of a nod to state governments, that's more federal. So the House of Representatives is national, the Senate is more federal in nature. And then he goes on, talks about the president, talks about how we amend the Constitution, says to amend the Constitution, you have to have a proposal by the Congress, which is more national, but then it has to be ratified by the states, which is more federal. And so his conclusion in Federalist 39 is that the Constitution is neither wholly national or federal. It really is an amalgam of the two. It's a good compromise between a national and a federal approach. So those 85 Federalist Papers, including number 39, were written to try and convince the anti-federalists to support and ratify this Constitution, that the Constitution did not create too strong of a national government. In addition to those 85 Federalist Papers, and if you are interested, there was also a series of papers called the Anti-Federalist Papers. So not to be outdone, the Anti-Federalists wrote their own set of Anti-Federalist Papers arguing against ratification of the Constitution. But as I always like to say, to the winner go the spoils. And so since the Federalists won and the Constitution got ratified, we teach the Federalist Papers in courses like this, and we really don't talk a whole lot about the Anti-Federalist Papers. But just know that there is that countervailing force out there, the Anti-Federalists writing their own papers to try and stop ratification. But the ratification of the Constitution really came about because the framers decided to amend the Constitution immediately as soon as they pass it. So at the convention, they come up with this constitution, and then they decide we are going to need to amend it immediately in order to get these states on board and to get the Anti-Federalists to agree to ratify the Constitution. And as you know, that's where we ended up with our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Interesting to note that there were actually supposed to be 12 amendments in the Bill of Rights. 2 of those proposed amendments did not get ratified. There is one amendment that didn't get ratified that would have limited the size of the districts, areas in the House of Representatives to 50,000 people. If that would have gotten ratified and become part of the Constitution, our 435-member House of Representatives that we know today would have actually been, as of today, about 4,326 members. So think about how difficult it is for us to gain agreement in a majority of 435 members of the House. Think about how difficult it would be to get agreement of a majority of 4,300 people in the House of Representatives. So it's probably a good thing that didn't get ratified and didn't become part of the Bill of Rights. Then the other amendment that did not get ratified was an amendment by James Madison. And that amendment called for if Congress wanted to increase its compensation, if it wanted a pay raise, before that pay raise could go into effect, you had to have an intervening election. So if Congress wants to get more money, they pass themselves a pay raise, they have to then stand for re-election before they can collect that money. That was written by James Madison. That was supposed to actually be the second amendment in the Bill of Rights, did not get ratified until 1992. That's what would eventually become the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So originally proposed 200 years before it was ratified, it eventually was ratified in 1992 as the 27th Amendment. The reason why it was able to be ratified in 1992 is because back when the framers were writing these amendments to the Constitution, they didn't put in what were called sunset clauses. Today, if you have a constitutional amendment that's proposed, there will be a sunset provision. That provision will say if this amendment is not ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures within 7 years, it is then null and void. Back then, you didn't have those provisions. And so that amendment that was written by James Madison back in 1790, that didn't have that sunset provision, and so it was still technically valid. A student in I think it was in Texas, I forget which city it was, but in Texas, wrote a term paper arguing that that amendment was still valid because it didn't have a sunset clause in it. I think he got a C on the paper, but undeterred by that, he went out there and started a national movement to get the remaining states to ratify the amendment to add it to the Constitution, and he was successful in 1992, and it became part of the Constitution as the 27th Amendment. So an amendment that was added in 1992 was actually written over 200 years earlier by James Madison, just kind of one of those little quirks of constitutional history. With the adding of these 10 amendments to this Bill of Rights, that was done to try and ameliorate the concerns of the Anti-Federalists and to get ratification of the new Constitution. The Constitution was then ratified in relatively short order. The problem with the ratification process is that in order to go into effect, the Constitution needs to be ratified by 9 out of 13 states. They got 9 states to ratify the Constitution relatively quickly within a couple of years. The problem was, of those 9 states that ratified it, New York was not one of those states. So these 85 Federalist Papers were written to the citizens of New York to try and convince the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. At that time in the late 1700s, the state of New York really was the linchpin of commerce in the colonies. That most of the goods that flowed in through the port of New York and would then go to the various states. If you didn't have New York as part of your United States, you would lose all that trade. And basically, the whole system would not function. So they knew they had to have the state of New York. So these Federalist Papers were actually authored to the citizens of New York to convince them to ratify this new Constitution. And obviously, they were successful in doing so. New York then ratified the Constitution, all the 13 states, and then eventually Vermont was added in. So 14 states ratified the Constitution, and the Constitution then went into effect. Second half of class, we'll talk about some of the details in the Constitution, but this Constitution is our social contract. It tells us the powers of government, the types of powers that individual citizens give up to their government, and then that government is expected to then utilize those powers judiciously to provide for the welfare of society. Well, one of the topics we have talked about over the past hour that keeps coming up is this idea of power. We've talked about separation of power horizontally and vertically. We've talked about balancing power between the different branches of government. We talked about the anti-federalists against the federalists in terms of the power of the national government. We've talked about power in terms of large states versus small states. We really haven't delved into the actual issue of power. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about what we mean by power. So my question to you is, what is a good, quick definition of the word power? What does power mean to you? How would you define the word power? Control. Ava says control. That's true. I think power is certainly revolves around the issue of control, oftentimes trying to control the actions and the behaviors of others. Oftentimes you control the actions and behaviors of others through the use of resources. So oftentimes when you think about power, we think about utilizing resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. If it's an action that they usually would do on their own, then chances are we're not going to have to exercise resources to get them to do that. So yeah, they're making decisions that impact yourself and others at times. Yes, we're trying to influence others through the use of resources. So to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do is a good basic definition of the term power. I want to do a little bit more nuanced one for us here in this class, and then we'll return to this more nuanced definition as we go through future class sessions. But this more nuanced definition of power comes to us from John Gaventa. I'll put his name in text chat. I like to talk about John Gaventa in all of these classes because I think he does a really nice job of telling us that power is not monolithic. There's just not one type or one definition of power. Instead, according to Gaventa, there are what he calls three faces or three different types of power. There's what he calls overt power, or I call it overt power, but it's the first face of power, which you call overt power. Then there's a second face or type of power called mobilization of bias. And then there's a third face or type of power called co-optation. Now, in order to study this idea of power, Gaventa decided that he needed to go on site at do some case studies. And he thought the one place where there was power that was clearly being exercised in a very authoritative way was in these coal mining towns. So he selected a coal mining town in eastern Kentucky and one in eastern Tennessee. And he went into these coal mining towns, and what he wanted to know is why were the coal mine owners so successful at getting coal mine workers to do things that were obviously not in their own rational self-interest? So why were they working 70 and 80-hour work weeks? Why were they working in very dangerous mine conditions? And the way in which mining works is that there's a propensity for mines to explode. That whenever you are in the mine and you are using the pickaxe, it causes, whenever the pickaxe hits the rock, it causes a spark. That spark can then ignite gas, which then can make the mine explode. So it's a very dangerous type of work condition. There was a process at the time that was called dusting of the mine, where if you dusted the mine, you could tamp down the gases and then make it less likely that the mine would explode. However, that dusting process was not being used in these two coal mining towns. It was too expensive and it really eroded the profits of the coal mine owners. So they decided not to do the dusting. So they're working these very dangerous mine conditions. And a lot of these coal miners were getting paid by tokens instead of money. So at the end of the work week, they would get tokens, and those tokens could only be redeemed in the general store, which was then run by the coal mine company. So it came to be known as the company store. You know, the old song that I owe my soul to the company store. You get paid in tokens, those tokens can only be redeemed in that company store. So the question he has, why were these coal mine workers willing to do all these things that were so counter to their own self-interest, but were in the interests of coal mine owners? So in order to answer that, he said, there are three different types of power going on. The first phase of power is what he called overt power. Overt power is when both parties know that power is being exercised. So one party knows that they are being influenced by another party to do something they otherwise would not do. So the example I always use when I was on campus for on-campus classes is that up on the second floor in a classroom in the SPA building, you get a test score back. You don't like the score on the test, and so you come up behind me and push me out the window. That's overt power. You're influencing me to fall out the window. I didn't want to fall out the window. It's counter to my rational self-interest, but you are forcing me to do it. According to Gaventa, this first face of power is the least dangerous face of power because both parties know what's going on. You know you are pushing me. If I see you coming, I know you're the one who pushed me. Both parties know what's happening. That's what he calls the least dangerous type of power. The second face of power is what he calls mobilization of bias, and this is what we call in policy agenda setting. The ability to get issues onto the agenda of a formal decision-making body or to keep issues off of the agenda of a formal decision-making body. So there were no coal mine safety regulation coming out of the state legislature in Kentucky and Tennessee because the coal mine owners were able to keep it off the state legislature's agenda. They were doing that. They were able to do that through campaign donations. So they provide campaign donations. Those the elected officials say, in exchange, we won't pass this coal mine regulation, and this regulation never gets passed. Coal mine workers only knew that there were no regulations coming out of the state legislature, but they didn't know why. They were not aware of this kind of cozy relationship between the coal mine owners and the state legislators. They didn't realize that these issues were being kept off the agenda. They didn't realize that mobilization of bias was being used. Then the third type or face of power is co-optation. Co-optation is the most dangerous type of power because according to Gaventa, co-optation is when you replace someone's opinions with your own. So the coal mine owners were able to convince the coal mine workers that working 80-hour weeks in dangerous mine conditions, getting paid with tokens, doing all those things that from an outsider perspective looked like that they were not in the interest of the coal mine workers. They were able to convince them that this was in their interest, that what was in the interest of the company was in the interest of the coal mine workers. That type of co-optation is dangerous because the coal mine workers didn't know that their ideas and their opinions were being co-opted. Well, you know, I told you my favorite question is, so what? Well, then so what? Why is this discussion of power important? It's important because it reminds us that power is multidimensional. There are different types of power that can be used in government. We as public administrators working in governmental organizations, we are vested with certain legal powers. The types of powers that we have will be different depending upon the situation we find ourselves in and the citizens who we are dealing with. So it's important for us to understand that power is just not one term, that there are different approaches to power. As we go through our 8 weeks together, we are going to return to this issue of power and the three different faces of power. When we see examples of power being used, we're going to ask the question, what type of power was that? Was that mobilization of bias? Was that agenda setting? Was that co-optation? What type of power was being used in that situation? But it's really important for us to kind of have that more nuanced definition of power because the power that we have as public administrators will emanate directly from the Constitution. Again, the reason why we spend tonight talking about the Constitution and these basic precepts of American government. So in that very first slide tonight, we talked about how government, how our Constitution really does divide up power both horizontally as well as vertically. And we all have a really good sense of separation of powers and how that works. What we oftentimes don't have as good of a sense of is that vertical separation of powers through our system of American federalism. So let's spend a few minutes just before our break here talking about that separation of powers vertically in the system of American federalism and what that system of federalism means for us as public administrators. So when we have this division of power vertically through our system of federalism, we need to recognize that this division of power is not static. This is a dynamic concept. The balance of power between national, state, and local governments certainly does shift and change over time. It also shifts and changes based upon the issue that we are dealing with and the policy that we are dealing with. In some issues and some policies, the power will reside with the national government. So national defense decisions, those powers reside with the national government. Environmental regulation, a lot of the locus of that power will reside with the national government as well, because the impacts of pollution cross over state boundaries. You have what we call your spillover effects. So the more that these effects spill over state boundaries, the more likely it is that the power will reside with the national government. There are other powers that reside more with state governments. So for issues such as driver's licenses, with the exception of the Real ID Act, before that, driver's licenses were issued by state governments. So they had control over driver's licenses. They had control over their driving laws. Elections, states traditionally control their own elections. And so that was a power that was at the state level. So it really depends upon the issue who has the power, as well as the period of time. Our system of federalism, this balance of power between different levels of government, has gone through a lot of changes since the late 1700s. And you'll see on this screen what I've done is I've listed along the left side of the screen, you'll see what we consider to be the different eras of American federalism, going from dual to competitive to cooperative to creative to new to our current system, which is contextual federalism. Then the inset box on the right provides to you three different models, theoretical models for understanding federalism. The coordinate authority model, the overlapping authority model, and the inclusive authority model. And so as we go through our different periods of federalism, I'll show you which period relates to which of those theoretical models. So the first period of federalism, from the founding of the nation up to the beginning of the Civil War, is often referred to as the era of dual federalism. It's called dual federalism because the national government had its scope of powers and state governments had its scope of powers. Those two areas of power did not really overlap with each other. They didn't combine with each other. They were separate and distinct from each other. That is what we call the coordinate authority model that you see there on the left of that inset. National government sphere of influence in that circle, and then state government sphere of influence, and never the two shall overlap. When you think about from the founding of the nation up to the Civil War, most of the responsibilities and most of the functions of government resided with state governments. The federal government had not really gotten into a lot of regulation of the economy in terms of regulation of businesses, regulation of workplace safety, regulation of food safety. That really wasn't the job of the national government. That was much more the job of state governments. So two distinct spheres of influence, the coordinate authority type of model. In the lead up to the Civil War, we know that we had these heightened tensions between northern and southern states, primarily over the issue of the institution of slavery. Southern states wanted to see not only the institution of slavery continued, they wanted to see it expanded into the territories. Northern states wanted to stop that expansion into the territories. The more you have the expansion of slavery into the territories, the more power you would then have for Southern states in Congress. And so you have this as a natural point of contention between Northern and Southern states, between non-slave and slave states. In the lead up to the Civil War, you're familiar with all the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the ways, the Missouri Compromise, all the ways in which Congress tried to stave off civil war by trying to put band-aids on the slavery issue. But it became very clear that those band-aids weren't going to work. And we were going to have a civil war primarily over the continuation and the expansion of the issue of slavery. Southern states viewed the institution of slavery as being elemental to their system of economy. So what Southern states believed is they would equate the institution of slavery with states' rights and kind of conflate those two terms. So whenever Congress, which was dominated by Northern states, would then impose regulations on Southern states that would have an impact upon their economy, Southern states then started to push back. And the three ways in which Southern states pushed back on a lot of this legislation coming out of Congress, the three different strategies were known as interposition. I'll put this all in text chat. Interposition, followed by nullification, followed eventually then by secession. So in interposition, what the Southern states would do is they would say, we disagree with this law coming out of Congress, and so therefore what we are going to do is we are going to use all of our resources to try and stop the implementation. We are interpose our resources between this law and the effective implementation of this law. When interposition didn't work, then they went to the second strategy, which was more severe, which was nullification. And they would say, we disagree with this law that's passed by Congress, so therefore we will just declare this law to be null and void. When that stopped working, then they moved to secession. And we know then in 1861, we saw South Carolina secede from the Union, then followed by the domino effect of several other states, and we then had the U.S. Civil War. After the Civil War was over, as we move into the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, we moved from what was called dual federalism into what a lot of scholars call competitive federalism. Competitive federalism runs from the end of the Civil War up to the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. In the era of competitive federalism, we are still focusing on that same model, the coordinate authority model, in that national and state governments still had their separate spheres of influence. The difference, though, was that the national sphere of influence grew in the late 1800s and the state sphere of influence shrunk. And it was very much what we would refer to in game theory as a zero-sum game. And in a zero-sum game, as one actor increases their power, they do so by definition at the detriment to the power of the other actor. So we saw the national government start regulating workplace safety and taking that away from state governments as a regulatory power, regulating food safety, regulating pharmaceutical medication safety, and so regulating commerce with the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and so on and so on. And so as we see the national sphere of influence increase, the national government then becomes predominant in many of these different policy areas. So it really became a competitive type of relationship between the two levels of government. Then the stock market crash hits, the Great Depression hits, FDR comes into office, and you're all familiar with FDR's response to the Great Depression, which was his New Deal. The creation of all these, what we call alphabet agencies, all these new programs to try and help pull the economy out of the throes of the Great Depression. Most of these programs were predicated upon grants and aid, where the national government would provide grants to state and local governments to help them recover from the Great Depression. So in that era, we move into this new designation known as cooperative federalism. Sometimes people call it fiscal, because oftentimes the relationship was being dictated by the use of grants. So from 1933, the advent of the FDR administration, up to 1965 in the Johnson administration, we had this era of cooperative federalism. In cooperative federalism, we then shift to our second theoretical model, which is the model of overlapping authority. Here we now have national, state, and local governments starting to overlap in terms of their functions, duties, and responsibilities. That overlapping model of federalism, I think, is still very much true today. If you deal in your agencies with any grant programs that come from the national government, you know that there's oftentimes a lot of participation by state and local governments in the implementation of those grants. Oftentimes, the national government today engages in what we call indirect administration, in that they are providing the resources, but then the actual direct administration, the actual implementation of the program, is then left to the state or the local level of government. But the roles and responsibilities now are overlapping. Then, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president, then becomes president. And then at the beginning of Johnson's term in office, his own term in office in 1965, he ushers in another approach to federalism that's known as creative federalism. Creative federalism believed that decision-making should be done primarily at the national level of government. Johnson had his Great Society, his war on poverty, the expansion of civil rights. All of that was predicated upon more decision-making at the national as opposed to the state level. Since the decision-making was being done at the national level, we now usher in our third theoretical model, which is inclusive authority model. You can see that's on the right side of the inset box. These three circles are then subsumed within each other. So local sphere of influence is subsumed within the state sphere. The state sphere of influence is then subsumed within the national sphere of influence. But everything flows down from the top in a very centralized manner. This is where we started getting a lot of these grants called categorical grants, which are these very specific grants of money for specific types of expenditures that remove a lot of the flexibility in decision-making from the recipient, from those state and local governments. We also saw the use of a lot of direct order mandates where the national government will come in and say, you must take this action at threat of civil or criminal penalty. So a very top-down type of an approach. That didn't last very long because when Nixon came into office in 1969, he brought with him his new approach to federalism. And federalism scholars are not terribly creative with how they name things. So it was called the new approach to federalism. And in Nixon's new approach to federalism, he took creative federalism and inverted it. So instead of saying that the decision-making should be done at the national level, he's saying decision-making should be done at the level of government that is closest to the people, being the local government. Who knows what's in the best interests of citizens than the governments that are located closest to those citizens, those local governments. So Nixon ushered in this new federalism through things he called deregulation, decentralization, and devolution. Let's remove a lot of these national regulations from the national government, from businesses, as well as state and local governments. Let's decentralize the decision-making so state and local governments can be involved in the decision-making, and let's devolve the power so that the decisions made at the state and local level, those state and local governments actually have the power and resources to then carry out those decisions. So that's what was known as new federalism. We saw it in the Nixon administration. We had a little break from it in the Carter administration from 77 to 81. But then when Reagan came in 81, he reinstituted new federalism. And then we saw it continue on through the Bush administration up until the Clinton administration. And then that's kind of the same thing as this overlapping authority model. So we kind of go from the inclusive authority model and creative federalism back to the overlapping authority model. So in our modern system of federalism, we are now what I would call contextual federalism. So who has the power, which level of government has the power, will depend upon the context of the issue. For some issues, the power still resides with the national government. For other issues, the power tends to reside with state governments. So, for instance, you think about the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration signed off on welfare reform. Welfare reform in 1996 was very much a decentralization of welfare policy, turning over a lot of its decisions to state and local governments. So it's very much decentralization. But at the same time, we saw the Clinton administration promote national blood alcohol content levels, the levels for drunk driving. Every state kind of had their own approach that they were using. The Clinton administration wanted a nationwide 0.08 blood alcohol content level. And then force state governments to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level by taking highway funds away from them. That's a very centralizing, very national type of an approach. So for some issues, very national, very centralizing. For other issues, very decentralizing. You think about George W. Bush and his administration, same type of thing. For certain issues, very decentralizing. Turn it over to state and local governments, remove the federal government from the equation. But for other things, such as education and things like No Child Left Behind, it was a very centralizing approach where the national government would establish expected standards of proficiency and then impose those standards onto state and local governments, and then have punitive measures of state and local governments to not achieve those proficiency standards. So today in federalism, it is very much issue-based in terms of who has the power. So what question for us here with this discussion of federalism? It impacts us as public administrators because most of the programs that we are implementing flow through different levels of government. So we need to understand which level of government has the power over what types of decisions as we are implementing these programs. We operate within a very fragmented, very complex environment. And that environment is made more complex and more fragmented because of this shifting dynamic nature of our system of American federalism. Federalism is not unique to America, but the way we do federalism is relatively unique. There are a lot of other countries around the world that have systems of federalism. Australia, Nigeria, all have systems of federalism. Our system, though, tends to be relatively unique in terms of the way in which it is more contextual and more issue-based than how it will be used in a lot of other nations. And then you compare it to more unitary countries. You think about something like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not have this system of federalism. Saudi Arabia is a very unitary type of system. Everything flows from the crown down through regional governments, but what regional governments do, that's going to all be dictated by the central government and by the crown. So it's a very unitary system, whereas we have this fragmented system of federalism. So doing public administration here in the US is going to look a lot different than doing public administration in a more unitary system, such as in Saudi Arabia. So let's keep with this issue of so what before we go on break. And just to kind of wrap up this discussion of the foundations of American government. So what does separation of powers and federalism mean for public administration? Number one, it means that as public administrators, we serve many masters. As public administrators, we are held accountable by legislatures. Legislatures have oversight ability. Legislatures also have the power of the purse strings, meaning that legislatures set up budgets. Legislatures decide what appropriations we receive as public organizations. So we have to be overseen and have to be accountable to the legislature. As public organizations, we are housed within the executive branch, which means that we are directly accountable to the executive branch and to the chief executive, whether that be a president or whether that be a governor at the state level. Also, our actions are overseen by the judiciary, and the judiciary can make a lot of decisions that will have a direct impact upon what we do as public administrators. The judiciary can do things such as structural remedies, whereby they will say, in order to remedy this constitutional violation, this is what you as a public administrator will need to do. They can issue consent decrees in which we have to agree to take certain types of actions to, again, remedy some past constitutional violations. Much more basically, the judiciary can issue what's called a writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is just a fancy term for an order. So the courts can say we're going to issue a writ of mandamus whereby we will order this public administrator or this public organization to take a specific type of action. So we serve masters horizontally at all three of those branches. But then we also serve a lot of masters vertically as well in terms of national, state, and local governments. When you serve all these different organizations and all these different individuals, you can get a lot of conflicting direction. So we can have certain direction that's handed to us by the legislature through enabling legislation and how to implement this policy. But then through executive orders and presidential signing statements, we can also then get different conflicting directions that are given to us by the executive. Sometimes we will have the judiciary step in and say, what Congress told you to do is unconstitutional. So you cannot do it. You have to do something else. So it leads to a lot of conflicting instructions and directions that we get as public administrators. It creates this complex network of both cooperation as well as competition. It's a complex network of cooperation in that most of our public programs and policies today are not delivered solely by one agency. They are usually being delivered by a network of different agencies all working together. So we have to cooperate with national and with state agencies in order to effectively and efficiently deliver these services. Whenever we're dealing with national and state agencies, we are also then in a world of competition, where we are oftentimes competing against another agency to demonstrate our need for existence. If our need for existence as an organization is not clear to budget makers, then our organization may very well go out of existence. There's a classic example of that from 1996, where my favorite federal organization, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, otherwise known as the ACIR, was actually taken out of existence by Congress. Congress zeroed out its budget because Congress lost faith in the Advisory Commission. When they took away its budget, the Advisory Commission had no other alternative but to just shutter its operations. They couldn't pay their office lease, they couldn't pay for these contracts, so therefore they went out of existence. In essence, what American federalism and separation of powers, our system of American government does, is it creates a very distinct and political environment in which we operate as public administrators. We need to, if we want to study public organizations and why they do what they do, why they behave the way in which they behave, we have to understand this very unique, this very political, this very conflictual and fragmented environment. That's why we'll talk about in future courses in the study of public administration. A lot of the study of public administration focuses on the environment in which public organizations operate. And we'll spend 1 week in this class talking about the environment of public administration. So American government gives us this very unique and very challenging environment in which public organizations operate. Private organizations don't have that same type of fragmented, challenging environment that we have. It's much less political, obviously, in the private sector as compared to over here in the public sector. So that in a very large microcosm is a discussion of the basic foundational principles of American government and what these foundational principles then mean for the study and practice of public administration. Hopefully this kind of puts us all on the same level playing field in terms of our knowledge of American government, so we can then move on and put more flesh on the bones in future courses future class sessions as we talk about the field of public administration. So before we go on a break for this evening, I know I've kind of gone a little bit long. I apologize for that. But are there any questions or points of clarification on any of this information we've talked about over the past hour and a half? All right. Then if not, I think we are all probably very much ready for a break. So let's go ahead and take a break. We'll say let's take a break until 5:50. Come on back at 5:50, and then we'll get into our discussion of the Constitution. We'll go through the different articles and the different amendments of the Constitution to make sure we all kind of have a working knowledge of what the Constitution says and how the Constitution affects us as public administrators. So come on back at 5:50 and we'll talk Constitution. Okay, welcome back. My clock says it's 5:50, so we are back from break. And in the time we have left tonight, I'd like to go through the Constitution. And I'm not going to go through it in, hopefully not in painstaking detail, but just kind of point out some of the more important parts of the Constitution for our system of American government and then what it means then for being a public administrator. So, as you probably know, if you've looked at the Constitution before, you know that the Constitution is a very well-organized document in that it is broken up into 7 different articles. Each article, for the most part, talks about a different concept. And so Article 1 talks about the legislature. Article 2 talks about the executive. Article 3 talks about the judiciary and really the Supreme Court. And then in Article 4, we have things like the full faith and credit provision. Article 5, how the Constitution is amended. Article 6, supremacy clause. Article 7, then how the Constitution is ratified. So each article then speaks to kind of different general topic. Now, we know in terms of Article 1 of the Constitution, we've established this bicameral legislative body. So we have a House of Representatives that's discussed in Article 1, Section 2, and then a U.S. Senate that's discussed in Article 1, Section 3. The first section of Article 1, Section 1, tells us about this bicameral legislature, that we have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. We know that the House of Representatives was designed to be the lower house that's more closely aligned to the people, that members of the House of Representatives are selected directly by the people. They're elected in by the people, as you would do in a Republican form of government. And the U.S. Senate, however, under the original Constitution, the Senate's the upper house, and so therefore members of the Senate under the original Constitution were selected by state legislatures as opposed to being elected directly by the people. Today, you're familiar with our House of Representatives at the national level. It has 435 members. It's Republican controlled, but it is a very slim Republican majority in the House. That House majority could be up for grabs once we get to November with the November election. Then we know the U.S. Senate is also very closely split, but it's a Democratic split. The important thing to remember about the Senate, however, is that even though we talk about being a 51 to 49 Democratic to Republican split, we also have to remember that 3 of those senators that we put on the Democratic side are actually independents. So people like Bernie Sanders and Angus King and Kristen Sinema, and now I guess we're going to have Joe Manchin. So we're going from 3 to 4. Those are members who consider themselves to be independent, but we put them on the Democratic side because they typically caucus with the Democratic Party. So we have these very close majorities in both the House and the Senate, and so those majorities are certainly going to be up for grabs in the November election. Here in the state of California, we also have a bicameral legislature in that we have a California State Assembly and a California State Senate. In the California Assembly, we have a total of 80 seats, and so that is the larger chamber. Then that chamber, you have members who serve 2-year terms, so much shorter terms. The leader of the California Assembly currently is Rivas. The California State Senate, we have 40 seats in the California State Senate. Those senators serve 4-year terms, and the current president pro tem of the California State Senate is Mike McGuire. And so they're both from the Democratic Party. Because here in California, we have very strong one-party government. We have what's called unified government, in that we have almost 3/4 majority Democrat in both the Assembly as well as the Senate. So, for example, in the California State Senate, of those 40 seats, 32 of those seats are held by Democrats, only 8 out of 40 seats held by Republicans. So you actually have was an 80% majority, Democratic majority in the California State Senate. In the Assembly, it's about a 3/4 Democratic majority. And then you also have a Democratic governor. And so whenever you have both houses of the legislature and the executive controlled by the same party, you have what's called unified government. That's kind of the norm here in California. At the federal level, the norm is certainly for divided government. So you have a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president, at least currently. We'll see what happens in November. So we kind of model our state legislature here in California after the legislature at the federal level. So as you go through Article 1 of the Constitution, you see Article 1, Section 2 talks about the House of Representatives. In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you must be at least 25 years old. You must at least be a citizen for 7 years, and you must live in the state in which you are chosen. We also know that in Article 1, Section 2, there have been changes made as a result of amendments. And so in Article 1, Section 2, there at the 3rd paragraph down, you see something that was referred to as the apportionment clause. Under the original Constitution, taxes were apportioned according to state population. so that larger states would pay more in taxes than smaller states. So under this original Constitution, a direct income tax levied directly on the income of individuals was considered to be unconstitutional. Now, if someone tells you don't pay your income taxes because it's unconstitutional, they would have been correct before the 16th Amendment. When the 16th Amendment in 1913 was added to the Constitution, the 16th Amendment says that Congress may levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. So that's why you see the apportionment clause in brackets here, because that has been changed by the subsequent 16th Amendment. Same type of thing here with the 3/5 compromise that has thankfully been removed from the Constitution. So there's no longer the 3/5 compromise in our current version of the Constitution. Some other things to pay attention to here. We do have a enumeration of the population. That's how we determine our congressional districts. And so we have that once every 10 years. That enumeration is an actual counting of the population. We just had an enumeration with the census in 2020. We'll have another one in 2030. Once we have the enumeration of the population, that's when we do engage in the redrawing of the district lines for the House of Representatives at the national level, and then for your assembly and your Senate districts at the state level. This is where gerrymandering occurs. And you're probably familiar with gerrymandering, but in political gerrymandering, a dominant political party in the legislature will redraw the district lines to try and benefit their party. That's why we end up getting some of these very strange types of congressional districts, these House districts that don't make a whole lot of sense from a geographic perspective, but for the dominant political party, they make sense from a political perspective. And not to get too much in a tangent, but what has occurred is throughout the decades of political gerrymandering, what the parties have done is they've created safe districts for their members. So if you're a member from a safe district, say you're a Republican and you're in a safe Republican district, you don't really have to worry about the general election because you're from a safe Republican district. You know that you're going to win re-election over a Democrat. What you're much more concerned about is you're much more concerned about the primary, where you're running against other Republicans. Primary elections, the people who tend to vote in primary elections tend to be your more ardent partisans, those who are more from one side of the political parties, the more extremists, if you will. I hate to use the term extremist, but those from a more extreme type of ideological bent. And so if you only have to worry about running in a primary election, then your decision making is going to be skewed toward either, if you're a Republican, more conservative decisions, or if you're a Democrat, more liberal progressive decisions. What that has done is the more safe districts we have, the more of that decision making that's been going on. And we have seen the two parties move away from each other and very much a hollowing out of the middle in Congress. And that's why it's become so difficult for us to gain agreement over the federal budget, to gain agreement really over most pieces of legislation, because the parties have become much more aligned with the extreme ideological ends of their party structures. We know that when there are vacancies in the House of Representatives, those vacancies can then be filled, at least temporarily, by the executive authority, which is the governor, and that the House of Representatives can choose its own leaders, its own officers. The one constitutional position in the House of Representatives that is mentioned here is the position of Speaker of the House. And we know that the Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson currently, and the Speaker of the House is then second in line to the President after the Vice President. So if the President cannot serve, it goes to the Vice President. If the Vice President cannot serve, it then goes to the Speaker of the House. Then we also know that in Section 3 of the Constitution, we talk about the U.S. Senate. U.S. Senate has equal representation, so 2 senators from each state. And under the original Constitution, those senators were selected by state legislatures. The Senate is divided up into thirds, so only 1/3 of the Senate will come up for re-election at a time. You don't want all 100 senators coming up for re-election. So 1/3 comes up every 2 years. As opposed to members of the House who serve 2-year terms, members of the Senate will serve 6-year terms. In order to be a member of the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years. And again, you have to live in the state in which you are chosen from. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. Vice president of the United States, in their service as president of the Senate, cannot vote unless there's a case of a tie. Vice President Harris actually was awarded an award from the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer for casting the most tie-breaking votes as a vice president in the history of the country. And I think what that shows is just underscores this big separation, this big chasm between the Democratic and the Republican parties in the U.S. Senate. Just like the House, the Senate gets to choose its own officers. The one constitutional officer beyond the vice president here in the Constitution is the president pro tem. The president pro tem of the Senate is Patty Murray from the state of Washington. The president pro tem is typically the longest serving member from the majority party in the Senate. So it used to be Pat Leahy, and now it's moved on to Patty Murray. In terms of impeachments, the House of Representatives has the ability to impeach executive officials. The U.S. Senate has the ability to then hold a trial for those impeachments. For the House of Representatives to impeach an executive official, they only need a simple majority to pass articles of impeachment. Those articles of impeachment then go over to the Senate, and the Senate will then hold a trial. We saw that happen once in the Clinton administration. We saw that happen twice in the Trump administration. Previous to the Clinton administration, that happened one time in the Andrew Johnson administration. So it's used to be a very rare occurrence. You had it in the 1860s, you had it in the 1990s, and then you had it twice in the last administration. When the Senate holds the impeachment trial, all senators must take an oath, and if you watch either of the Trump impeachment trials, you saw this. The senators have to all sign the oath book that they are taking an oath, and from the moment they sign that oath book, they are supposed to be present in the chamber, doing no other business except for listening to evidence in the impeachment trial. The impeachment trial is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So John Roberts presided over the two Trump impeachment trials. William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice in the 90s, presided over the Clinton impeachment trial. In terms of impeachment, impeachment does not extend beyond just removal from office and disqualification from enjoying any other office. Now, this is was a controversy that went on in the last Trump impeachment. This idea of if you are found guilty of the crime, if you are found guilty of what you're being tried of for impeachment, then you will be removed from office. And you need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to find the president guilty or another executive official guilty. If you are found guilty by a 2/3 majority, then you are removed from office. But as you can see in this clause of the Constitution, Section 3, it says, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor. The question that went on in the Trump impeachment was that if he was found guilty and removed from office, would he then also be disqualified? And the way this is written is you see a comma and disqualification. So the question are those two terms conjoined together? That if you're removed from office, are you then automatically disqualified, or can you be removed from office and then not disqualified from holding a future office? That's kind of an unresolved question, because in the past with judges, at certain points of time, the Senate has combined those two terms together, that if you're removed, you have to be disqualified. At other times, they've removed people, but not then disqualified them from future office. So it's a really interesting constitutional question that has yet to be resolved. Section 4 talks about the time and manner of holding elections and how frequently that the houses must meet. Each house gets to judge its own elections. This is jumping all over on me here. Then in Section 6, we have this discussion of compensation, that members will receive compensation for their services, but there's also this emolument clause. meaning that they cannot receive additional compensation for their work beyond the compensation that they are receiving as a member of the House or the Senate. So there's a prohibition against receiving that extra money. That extra money is referred to as an emolument. You also cannot serve in any other civil office while you are a member of the House of Representatives or a member of the U.S. Senate. Section 7 then tells us about some provisions for legislation. So in Section 7, we know that all bills that deal with revenue, so any bill that increases taxation, must begin in the House of Representatives. It cannot begin in the U.S. Senate. And the framers did that for the explicit reason that people are most affected by tax increases. So it should start in the body of Congress that is more closely attached to the people. That would be the House of Representatives. Then we also know here in Article 1, Section 7, that before a piece of legislation can go to the president for the president's signature, it must pass the House and the Senate in identical version. This is why we have conference committees. And so when a bill comes out of the House, it probably looks different than the bill that comes out of the Senate. So therefore, you have a conference committee, and the conference committee hammers out the differences between the House version and the Senate version. So it has to be in a uniform version before it can go to the president for the president's signature. Article 1, Section 8. This is a big consideration for us in terms of the powers of the national government, specifically the powers of the U.S. Congress. So here in Article 1, Section 8, as you probably know from American government, you have a couple of different things going on here. One thing you have going on is what's called the enumeration of powers. An enumeration of powers is a listing of the powers. And so here we are specifically listing each of the powers that belong to the U.S. Congress. Whenever you enumerate power, whenever you list power, you are by definition limiting power, because the assumption is here are all the powers that are listed that Congress can do. Anything that is not enumerated, anything that is not listed here, is then beyond the powers of Congress. So when you enumerate powers, you are limiting the power of Congress. This was obviously a nod to the anti-federalists in their concern for the Constitution creating too strong of a national government. So we're very familiar with some of the enumerated powers of Congress. They have the ability to lay and collect taxation. We're all very familiar with that. To borrow money, and Congress is very, very good at borrowing a whole lot of money. To regulate commerce. This is an important one. This third power here in Article 1, Section 8 is what's called the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Whenever Congress tries to expand its power, especially expand its power over the states, it oftentimes does so with this justification of the Commerce Clause. That whatever action it's taking to do its power of regulating commerce between the several states. Congress has the power to establish uniform rules of naturalization, has the power to coin money and the sole power to coin money, the power to punish counterfeiters of that money, to establish post offices. This is why we have a U.S. Postal Service. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. That sounds like a very simple one little line there. That's extremely important, because that means that Congress had the ability to establish the entire federal judiciary with the exception of the Supreme Court. Article 3 only establishes one court, the Supreme Court, and then all other courts in the federal judiciary are established by Congress, and Congress did so through the Judiciary Acts. Define and punish piracies and felonies. To declare war, only Congress can declare war. Presidents, if they want a declaration of war, they must go before a joint session of Congress, as was done for World War I and for World War II, because only Congress has the ability to declare war. Presidents can engage in military action. They can send troops to military zones, but for an actual declaration of war, you have to go through Congress. To raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy. Again, this was the big concern over a lack of national defense, a lack of a standing army and navy. Make rules for governing regulation of land and naval forces. calling forth militias, again, this control over national defense, disciplining militias, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over a district that's going to be known as the District of Columbia. And so DC is not a state, as we know. DC is an area that's under the control of the US Congress. And then at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we get the very famous elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. They have the power to make all laws which would be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. So in order to carry out all these enumerated powers, they can do whatever they need to do and pass whatever law they need to do in order to carry out those enumerated powers. So again, here is where Congress expanded its powers over state governments. It uses either the Commerce Clause and or this elastic clause to the Constitution. So you can see we have a duality of approaches here in Article 1, Section 8. The enumeration of powers is a nod to the anti-federalists to limit the power of Congress. The elastic clause is more of a nod to the federalists to give this kind of open-ended power to Congress to do pretty much what they consider to be necessary and proper. Then we see the Article 1, Section 9. This is the prohibition against banning the slave trade. This was that compromise between slave and non-slave states. Congress cannot suspend the privilege of writ of habeas corpus. You're familiar with habeas corpus. It literally means to present the body. So if someone is arrested, you can't arrest someone and then hide them away and not tell anybody where they are or what they're being charged with. Congress may not pass any bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is basically just considering someone guilty without the benefit of a proper trial. So they can't just say you're guilty and not provide you with a trial. They cannot pass any ex post facto laws, and ex post facto law is an after the fact law. So you did something yesterday when it was legal. Tomorrow, Congress makes it illegal, and then they punish you for what you did when it was legal. Can't do that. That's an ex post facto law. And so basically here in Article 1, Section 9, we're saying this is what Congress may not do. Here are the limitations. Another really important limitation here is that Congress may not draw money from the Treasury, but in the consequence of an appropriation. This means that this is what's called the Appropriations Clause. It means that Congress must appropriate money before it can spend the money. Appropriation is just the process of saying this is how the money will be spent. So they have to tell us how the money is going to be spent before they're able to go out there and actually draw that money from the Treasury and actually spend that money. No titles of nobility, so no knights or sirs or any of those types of titles like you see over in Europe. Congress may not do that. And then Article 1, Section 10 lays out limitations on the states. So states cannot enter into treaties. That's the sole domain of the president and Congress. They cannot levy imposts and duties. And so here are all they cannot have titles of nobility, all the different limitations then on state government. So Article 1, Section 9 limits Congress. Article 1, Section 10 then limits state governments. Article 1 of the Constitution that deals with the U.S. Congress is by far the lengthiest and the most detailed part of the Constitution. The framers really spent a lot of time and put a lot of thought into the details in Article 1. That has led some political scientists to make the argument that Congress is the quote-unquote first branch of government. Not only are they discussed in the first article of the Constitution, but their discussion is much lengthier and more detailed than any of the other two branches. Then in Article 2, we get into the president and the executive branch. For the president, in order to be president, you have to be 35 years old, and you have to be a natural-born citizen, and you have to also reside in the U.S. for at least 14 years. But you have to be a natural-born citizen in order to be president. This is why, as we go through the list of presidential succession, sometimes people will get jumped over in that list. And so as you go through the list of presidential succession, it starts with the vice president, then it goes to Speaker of the House, then it goes to President Pro Tem of the Senate, then it goes to the leaders in the cabinet of the departments by the ages in which the departments were established. So the leader of the oldest department is then next, and then you go through until the newest department. In the past, for example, Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, would be jumped over because she's not a natural born citizen. Um, Granholm is an example in the current cabinet that she would be jumped over because she was born in Canada. It's not a natural born citizen. So we have the president established, we have the requirements for being president established, and then we have the establishment of this thing called the Electoral College. And I'm sure you are familiar with the Electoral College. It's a relatively unique way of selecting a president in comparison to a lot of other nations around the world. It is germane to us because we're moving into a presidential election. So it's important that we have at least a working knowledge of the Electoral College. The way the Electoral College works today is there are 538 votes in the Electoral College. To be elected president, you must win a majority, which means you must win 270 electoral votes. Currently, the way in which electoral votes are distributed is that each state has a number of electoral votes equal to its representation in the House and the Senate. Obviously, as the most populated state, California has the most electoral votes, then followed by Texas, then followed by New York, and so on and so on. Very small states with small populations, such as Montana, and Wyoming, will have 3 electoral votes. They have 1 representative in the House of Representatives and 2 senators to give them 3 electoral votes. District of Columbia was given 3 electoral votes, so in the 23rd Amendment, which is why we have 538 electoral votes as opposed to 535. In all states, except for states like Nebraska and Maine, the winner of the popular vote in that state then gets all that state's electoral college votes. So every candidate will put forth a slate of electors that are supposed to be bound to that candidate. And then if that candidate wins the state of California, then their slate of electors will then be the electors that are certified by the governor as the electors for California. Then in December, those electors will all gather in Sacramento. They will then cast their ballot for president. All those ballots from the 50 states are then transported to Congress and are opened in front of a joint session of Congress. That's what we saw on January 6th in the last election. That was the counting of ballots, the counting of electoral ballots that was disrupted by the insurrection on January 6th. So what happens then if no one gets a majority of the votes in the Electoral College? It has happened in the past. When that happens, the election then goes into the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, each congressional delegation gets 1 vote. So it's not one person, 1 vote. It's each delegation gets 1 vote. And then the House selects the president, and then the Senate selects the vice president. So in a very close election, it is possible that neither candidate will get 270 votes. It's possible it could be a 269 split. In the past, we've had situations like the Krupp bargain back in 1824, where none of the 4 candidates got a majority of the Electoral College. It went in the House of Representatives. The House selected John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson, even though Andrew Jackson had won more popular votes than John Quincy Adams. As recently as 2016, we saw Hillary Clinton win the majority of the popular vote, and we saw Donald Trump win the majority in the Electoral College. So it does occur on occasion. And again, I want to go through this a little bit more quickly. I'm kind of getting bogged down some details here. So I know we don't have a lot of time left, but a couple more really important things that come out of this first section of Article 2. There is an oath that all presidents must take. And you see that oath there in that final paragraph. I do solemnly swear or affirm I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is an oath that all presidents need to take. In the Obama administration, when President Obama was being inaugurated, Chief Justice Roberts, for lack of a better term, screwed up the oath and said the oath incorrectly. He was so concerned about that because the oath is actually in the Constitution that he really demanded that he go to the Oval Office later and re-administer the oath correctly to President Obama, because he felt that it would really lead to a question of the legitimacy of the administration if that oath was not actually followed to the word. So just a little interesting piece of trivia for you. Section 2 then gets into the roles and responsibilities of the president. We know the president is commander in chief of the armed forces. We know that the president can enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, which makes the president chief diplomat and chief of state. We also know that the president can appoint people to executive positions, which makes the president the chief executive. Some of those appointments are then subject to confirmation by the U.S. Senate. All those roles are constitutional roles that are provided to the president. Then we also know that the president has to give a State of the Union address, and that comes to us in Article 2, Section 3, that from time to time give to Congress information on the state of the State of the Union. That is a State of the Union address. There aren't a whole lot of particulars here, but the tradition has become that once per year, the Congress will offer an opportunity for the president to come over, usually in late January or early February, to provide a State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress. And then we also know that presidents and other civil officers may be impeached for what are considered to be treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so the House passes articles of impeachment, trial is held in the Senate, and then if they are convicted, they will then be removed from office. Again, there's a lot of consternation about the ambiguity in these terms. High crimes and misdemeanors. What actually constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor? Impeachment is a political process. So that is inherently a political question. What is considered to be a high crime and misdemeanor is really kind of left up to the judgment of the senators who are serving as the jury in that impeachment trial. Article 3 lays out the judiciary, but really all it does is lays out the Supreme Court. So there's one court known as the Supreme Court. There are no qualifications in the Constitution for serving on the Supreme Court. You don't have to be any minimum age. You don't have to be a citizen. You don't have to have any legal training. None of that is laid out in Article 3. Also, Article 3 lays out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court shall have both original as well as appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means a case can go directly to the Supreme Court. So if it's a case of great urgency that has a direct impact on the interpretation of the Constitution, that can, through original jurisdiction, go to the Supreme Court. However, 99.9999% of all cases get to the Supreme Court through appellate jurisdiction. They begin at the trial court level, get appealed up to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then eventually can be appealed up to the Supreme Court. So no, the Supreme Court does not accept many cases. The vast majority of cases are just not accepted without any comment whatsoever. When they do accept a case, it goes on to their docket. They hold oral arguments, and then they will have conferences. Then they'll write decisions, and those decisions typically majority of them tend to be released somewhere in the range of June 1st until June 30th. Depending upon how busy their docket is. This year, we saw a very full docket, and so some of those decisions were actually released once we got into July. Article 4, one of the main things that comes out of Article 4 is the full faith and credit provision. Every state must provide full faith and credit to the laws of every other state, meaning that states must respect the laws of other states. That's what full faith and credit means. Citizens in Section 2, citizens of a state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Again, you have to respect those laws between states. And if we have any new states that want to be admitted into the Union, those new states must get the approval of Congress. Past few years, we've heard a lot about possible ballot initiatives to break California up into multiple states. For new Californians to be join into the Union, they would then have to go through Congress, and Congress would have to approve of that. Article 5 looks at how we amend the Constitution. Now, this was a remedy to the problem with the Articles. The Articles could only be amended through a unanimous agreement of all 13 states. Here, we come up with a process that is not unanimous. So in order for an amendment to be added to the Constitution, there's a proposal stage and there's a ratification stage. The proposal stage happens in Congress. So typically, amendments are proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate. They are then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That's the first way to amend the Constitution under Article 5. That is the only approach we have ever used for amending the Constitution. But there are three other ways you can amend the Constitution as well. We just haven't ever used these. The second approach is proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. The third approach is you have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then have amendments come out of that national constitutional convention. That would be the proposal. And then they're ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Then the fourth way is 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then those amendments get ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. You can see the problems with options 2, 3, and 4. Options 2, 3, and 4 all consist of some type of a constitutional convention. We saw what happened the last time we had a constitutional convention. We threw away our constitution, the articles, and we completely replaced it with a brand new constitution. So I think there's a little consternation, a little bit of fear about whether or not we really want to go down that road to have a constitutional convention. And I should mention then in section 4 of Article 4, I mentioned this before, the guarantee of a Republican form of government for each state, that each state will have a Republican form of government, as we mentioned at the outset tonight. Article 6, the big thing that comes out of Article 6 is obviously this supremacy clause, a very strong pronouncement of national government power. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So whenever a state constitution comes into conflict with the national constitution wins. State laws come into conflict with national laws win. This is, again, a very strong pronouncement of national government power. This is something that was done at the behest of the Federalists and much to the consternation of the Anti-Federalists. This is one of the reasons why the Anti-Federalists wanted to see the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, added. And then Article 7 just talks about the ratification of the Constitution. It gets ratified once we have 9 out of 13 states ratify it. So, as we then move down, we then have, that's the Constitution. Those are some of the provisions in the original Constitution itself. Then, as we know, the Bill of Rights were added, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution added to mitigate some of the concerns of the Anti-Federalists. And you're familiar with many of these amendments. The First Amendment you're familiar with, the right to free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of press. All those basic fundamental freedoms are found there in the First Amendment. Now, one thing that Americans oftentimes don't talk about is that these are not necessarily blanket provisions. There can be still limitations associated with things such as freedom of speech. The very famous Supreme Court quote about you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. If your free speech, if the speech that you are using causes damage or causes potential harm to society, to the public, there can be reasonable limitations on that freedom of speech. Same type of thing with freedom of religion. There are two parts of freedom of religion. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, meaning you can believe whatever you want to believe. There can be no national religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, we do know that there can be limitations placed upon the exercise of religion if the exercise of religion places others at harm or erodes the constitutional rights, First Amendment rights of other Americans. Same thing with freedom of press. For the most part, we have unfettered freedom of the press. There's no what's known as prior restraint. In a lot of countries, you have this thing called prior restraint, where the government can basically censor things and say, you cannot publish this. We had a very famous case, the Pentagon Papers case, many movies made about it and books written on it, that questioned the idea of prior restraint. For the most part, if government is going to stop the publication of something, it needs to have a direct and profound implication on national security. For the most part, we do not do prior restraint in this country in terms of freedom of speech. The right to peaceably assemble can also be limited in that you may have to get a permit from your local government if you want to have an assembly, if you want to have a protest on a street, they may require that you get a permit for that protest. We're all very familiar with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The question here that we always get into is what types of gun control limitations can be placed upon gun ownership within the parameters of the Second Amendment. That initial clause there, a well-regulated militia, is something that intergroups such as the NRA don't really talk a lot about. They look at the rest of Second Amendment. Gun control groups will focus squarely on that provision of a well-regulated militia. We're not going to get into it in this class, but if you are interested in knowing what the framers really thought when they were writing these amendments, what Madison really thought, you can go into the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, you have framers such as Alexander Hamilton in several of the papers talking about how he defines a well-regulated militia, what he considers to be well-regulated, how many times they would need to meet to be well-regulated, what weapons, make sure that they have weapons so that they are well-regulated, and will give us some real specifics about what he considers to be a well-regulated militia. The Third Amendment we don't talk a whole lot about, but that is no quartering of soldiers. This kind of fits in with what's called the implied right to privacy. Your privacy to your home, you cannot be forced to allow soldiers into your home. Fourth Amendment is your right to against unwarrantable, unreasonable search and seizure. This is why the police need to get a search warrant before they can come in and search your property. So it's your criminal justice protection. Fifth Amendment also provides you with your criminal justice protections, the right to an indictment by a grand jury, the right to trial if you are in jeopardy of being deprived of life, liberty, and property, the right to not be tried twice for the same crime. This is your protection against double jeopardy. Now, some of these Fifth Amendment rights have never been fully incorporated to include limitations against state government actions. And if they have been fully incorporated, it's been a very slow, very gradual process. Let me give you an example in terms of double jeopardy. When we say incorporated, what we mean is that initially the Supreme Court looked at the Bill of Rights as being these are protections against national government action, not necessarily protections against actions done by state governments. So that was true for this double jeopardy protection. There is a famous case of a person by the name of Palco in the state of Connecticut. Mr. Palco is being tried for second, I think it was second-degree murder, if I'm not mistaken. The state of Connecticut was trying to get the death penalty for this. They couldn't get first degree, they could only get second-degree murder. So the state of Connecticut then decided to retry him to try and get him on first-degree murder. It was the same exact case. It was the same exact facts of the case. They were basically trying him twice for the same crime. Second time, they got him found guilty of first-degree murder and then sentenced to death. Palco took his case to the Supreme Court and said, this is a clear violation of my double jeopardy protections. Connecticut should not be able to try me twice for the same crime. Supreme Court said, we're sorry, Mr. Palco, this only applies to the national government. It does not apply to the state of Connecticut. Double jeopardy was not extended to apply to a protection against state government action until 1968, a full over 30 years after Palco took his case to the Supreme Court in a case called Benton versus Maryland. And finally, at that point, double jeopardy was then a protection against state as well as national government action. Clearly, it was too late to help Mr. Palco, but it just gives you an example of how the incorporation of some of these rights took a long time to include the state government level. Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a speedy and public trial. You have the right to be informed about the charges against you and to confront the witnesses who are brought against you. You're also provided with the ability to have counsel to assist in your defense. This is why we have your Miranda rights, and you watch any cop shows, you know about the Miranda rights that need to be read to people when they are arrested or when they are being questioned. That is, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can and will be held against you. You have the right to a counsel or an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. That is a requirement that comes from the case Miranda versus Arizona. And that's something from the Supreme Court. So those are your Sixth Amendment rights. Your Seventh Amendment rights, you have a right to a jury trial in a civil case if that civil case amount is more than $20. Again, $20 meant a lot more with the Bill of Rights than it does today. In the Eighth Amendment, you have the protection against excessive bail and excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. This is where we talk a lot when we talk about the death penalty. And does the death penalty constitute cruel and unusual punishment? At certain points in time, the Supreme Court has said yes and has outlawed the use of the death penalty. Then in cases like the Gregg versus Georgia case, the Supreme Court said, well, no, we're going to allow states to use the death penalty because it doesn't constitute necessarily cruel and unusual punishment. So again, that's that incorporation issue of incorporating protections to include state government action. The Ninth Amendment to the Constitution says that all these rights given in the Constitution should not be construed as denying or disparaging others retained by the people, which means that just because we're giving all these powers in the Constitution to the national government, it doesn't mean that people do not retain all those other rights. So basically, the rights not given, those are rights retained by the people. And then we reiterate that only for states in the 10th Amendment. Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. This 10th Amendment was a big nod to the Anti-Federalists, where in the 10th Amendment, the framers were saying, okay, we're going to say that all these powers that are not explicitly talked about in the Constitution, those are reserved for the state level. This is your Reserve Powers Amendment. This is what runs kind of counter to the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 and to the Elastic Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The Constitution is very much a series of compromises, and that's why we sometimes see some contradictory language that then needs to be interpreted by future courts and by future generations. And then to go very quickly through this, the 11th Amendment then limits the judicial power of the federal government in terms of reaching to cases that deal with citizens from one state against citizens from another state. 12th Amendment was the doing of Thomas Jefferson. If you've seen the Hamilton musical, you're very familiar with the animosity between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And so Thomas Jefferson wanted to make sure that the person who came in second would no longer become the vice president. And so that's what we get with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. One of the reasons why Aaron Burr then went out there and almost tried to start his own revolution and start his own country. And Jefferson actually wanted to try him for treason and have him execute it. So interesting part that was not really included in the Hamilton musical. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment provides us with equal protection. So this is a very important one. In the 14th Amendment, this equal protection expands equal protection not just from the national government, but also to actions by the state governments as well. And so this is kind of what we use in order to hopefully make sure that state governments are not violating the civil rights and liberties of their citizens. 15th Amendment says that the right to vote cannot be abridged based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment then gives us the direct income tax, that Congress may levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. So this is why the direct income tax is now constitutional, thanks to the 16th Amendment. The 17th Amendment makes senators directly elected by the people, so no longer selected by state legislatures. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. The 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. The 20th Amendment changes the terms of the president and Congress, moving their terms from beginning up in March to beginning in January, because there's just way too much lag time between an election and when their terms would begin. 21st Amendment then repeals prohibition. 22nd Amendment gives us a two-term limit for presidents. So as a result of FDR running for the presidency 4 times, we decided to put a two-term limitation on presidents. 23rd Amendment provides 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia. 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes, these poll taxes that were being used oftentimes by southern states to disenfranchise and deprive people of their votes. The 25th Amendment lays out for us the process of presidential succession. And this became a very important bone of contention during the Trump administration, where some Democrats in Congress wanted to use the 25th Amendment to get Vice President Pence to declare President Trump incapacitated and then essentially take over as president. What the 25th Amendment says is that the vice president, in consultation with the majority of members of the cabinet, if they agree that the president is no longer able to carry out their duties, then they can declare the president incapacitated, and then the vice president would take over as president. It would then be up to the president to then contact Congress whenever the president felt that they were ready to resume their duties, and then tell Congress, I'm ready to resume my duties. But this is just a way in which the president's unable to carry out their duties, a way in which the vice president can then step in and take over. There's also a provision here that was controversial in the 25th Amendment, where it doesn't just have to be a majority of members of the cabinet, but Congress can establish their own committee and use their own committee to then declare a president incapacitated. 26th Amendment then gives the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then finally, the last amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, provides us with Madison's amendment that the compensation of members of Congress cannot vary until an intervening election has occurred. I know we went through that very quickly because we're almost out of time, but that's kind of an overview of the 7 articles and the 27 amendments in the federal Constitution. We don't go through the California State Constitution in this class because the California State Constitution is literally the longest constitution in the world. There is no constitution in the world that is longer than the California State Constitution. The California State Constitution has been amended well over 500 times, as opposed to 27 times with the federal Constitution. One of the reasons why the Constitution in California has been amended so often is because of the initiative referendum process. So we see some of these propositions on the ballot will sometimes be constitutional amendments. We can amend the Constitution at the ballot box, and oftentimes we do. That's why we have over 500 amendments to the Constitution. Also, the amendments to the California Constitution don't look like the amendments in the federal Constitution. So in the federal Constitution, we append the amendments to the end of the Constitution. In the California Constitution, we then amend the language in the Constitution itself. So we'll actually amend language in different parts of the Constitution, as opposed to appending all 500 plus of these at the end of the document. But it's important for us, I know we only have a minute left, but it's important for us as public administrators to at least have a working knowledge of the Constitution, and especially those Bill of Rights, those provisions, those liberties that are provided in the Bill of Rights, so that we can endeavor not to violate those provisions, those protections. And as long as we understand what those protections are, and we do our best good faith effort to not violate those protections, then we're going to benefit from this thing called qualified good faith immunity. If you haven't looked through the Constitution yet, I would ask that you go ahead and just kind of take a look through it. You certainly don't have to memorize it. You're not going to be tested necessarily on the Constitution, but it's important as public administrators that we at least know the parameters that are included in the Constitution so that we endeavor not to violate those liberties and those protections. Okay, in the last few seconds, just a reminder as we wrap it up tonight, you have Canvas essay number 1 and 2 responses to classmates due next Tuesday, and then you also have the initial skills self-assessment due next Tuesday as well. If you're not in the MPA program, as we look ahead to the draft advancement form, do send me an email and tell me I'm not in the MPA program, and then I'll waive the draft advancement requirement. But that draft advancement form will then be due on the following week after that. Okay. We're out of time, but any last second questions before we call it a night? I apologize for talking so much, but I did want to get through all this information just so we have all the same foundational information to then move on next week. Next week, we're going to get into accountability and ethics. We'll talk about why we are held to higher accountability ethics in the public sector. And yes, to confirm, the Canvas essay and the 2 responses are due at the latest by midnight on Tuesday. If you can get your initial response done before that, then at least people will have something to respond to. But the very last time for the tournament will be midnight next Tuesday. Kelly, go ahead.
I just want to verify, we didn't have to respond to the introductions, correct, Professor?
That is correct. Yeah, you did not have to respond to any introductions. That was all ungraded, no grades attached to that.
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. I kept you a minute long. I'll give you a minute back next week at least. So have a great week. Have a great evening. And we'll do accountability next week. I'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.